Hi, we return to 2 Samuel 12 today after Nathan and Yahweh's name has indicted David, and as we'll see, and you can see it right now on the left side of your screen at the top, David confesses his sin, and then a scene unfolds that has a surprising twist in it, which is to say David fasts and mourns for the child while it's living, and then when it dies, he gets up and eats, and people wonder what's going on. So as we enter into this scene, you can see on the right side of the screen, you've been following through these various issues of the gaps in these chapters in 2 Samuel 11 and 12, all the things that the authors have left out that we either would like to hear or we need to know in order to interpret the story. And here are some of those for our section here, and I won't go over those in detail. I'll cover those as we go. But we can, just a quick glimpse of this, we can recognize there are many gaps here in terms of understanding why things are happening. And one of the big gaps that we see here is, do we trust that David is sincere? Almost all scholars take this as the moment where he's convicted and he publicly mourns and fasts, and that this is a sincere action on David's part. But is it? We know that at the beginning of 2 Samuel, he gave a big public speech honoring Saul and Jonathan, and we certainly know that David loved Jonathan, but he didn't have a lot of love for Saul, and yet it was the politically expedient thing to do to publicly announce that anybody who is God's anointed would be somebody that David would praise in their death. Similarly, here, a child is certainly something that David, we would think, would want to have live. And yet, this child who's never named in the story by anybody is certainly a problem to David. He did not ask for the pregnancy. Bathsheba told him that she was pregnant, and that led to him doing what he probably didn't want to do, which have one of his great generals, or at least one of his great officers, Uriah, killed. And so this child carries the hint of Uriah from within David, and he might well want this child dead. But there's also another level we can look at this, and that's where people like Joel Baden and Brooke Halpern have acting suspiciously toward David dig even deeper and wonder, is this child even a real part of the story in the sense of historical? Which is to say, is it Solomon who's really the love child, and this story of this child who dies who's not named is just made up and inserted here? Because maybe the issue really is Solomon and establishing that Solomon has nothing to do with Uriah. We can't answer those questions in the outset, and maybe we can't answer them at all. But it's certainly one of the levels in which we ought to question of whether what is presented here as a performative act of mourning and fasting is just that, performative more than sincere. And you can decide for yourself as we go. So, as we've been doing in this section, we've been looking at the structure here, not quite a chiasm, but really important today, the pink part we're going to be looking at here, although we're starting in verse 13 here, is parallel to what we saw with David and Uriah in chapter 11. There are many echoes there, explicitly or implicitly, in terms of language, but also one can ask, is David's mourning for this unnamed child, in a way, consciously or unconsciously, an expression of mourning for the dead Uriah and grieving for his action? In the scene we just saw, Yahweh's complaint against David was not directly the killing of Uriah. It was that Yahweh had given David so many things, and he took Uriah's woman when God would have given him more and more. So it was the taking that was at issue, not directly the murder, although Yahweh noted in Nathan's summary that the death of Uriah was an element of it. So we'll just have to ask whether that's an element that the structure reveals in the background there. And as we've been looking in our section here, at least this part here from 14 to 25, forms a very nice chiasm. And you can see it there, and the beginning and the end is Uriah's woman. Here is Bathsheba, but the only other time she's named Bathsheba other than the very beginning. So the parallel there, David and Bathsheba, and then here in the B parts, the not eating food and the question about not eating food. And then the C parts here, the question if there's a child dead, and then the center, he perceived he was dead. And notice how much the key word child here is in this, yeled, although David once uses the word na'ar for his perception of it. But otherwise, it's all yeled, and many things about the unnamed child here. And so that's the part we're going to look at here. So let's just jump right into our story. So David responds to Nathan's summary of Yahweh's upset, not upset at Nathan and not upset at Yahweh, but with a very simple confession, I have sinned against Yahweh. And it's hard to argue with that there's nothing sincere about that. That's certainly the reality, and he describes it as sin against Yahweh, not against Bathsheba or against Uriah, and that's what we heard. And so in a way, it's complete, and Rochelle Gilmore notes it, what I was just saying, not against Uriah or Bathsheba. So then Nathan speaks one more time, and then their meeting is ended. Nathan says to David, "Now Yahweh has put away your sin, you shall not die." And my note below has, in great contrast with Saul, when Samuel comes to him and Saul begs that he be forgiven for not killing the king of Amalek, Samuel will have nothing to do with it. "No, you did it, and it's all over. Yahweh has abandoned you. It's all over." But not so here. And this is part of the argument that people like Gilmore and others make, that these stories are here actually to strengthen David's claim to monarchy. That since he's not going to die, and the unnamed child that nobody really cares about immediately, maybe in the abstract that we don't want a child to die, but it's an unnamed child that obviously has no part, and nobody is mourning that specific child. But people would certainly mourn the death of Jesus, or at least miss him in the power that he has to raise Israel and Judah up above the nations surrounding, etc. And so the fact that he does not die, and that Yahweh can overlook this, pass it over, both gives future kings permission to be caught doing a bad thing, but also suggests that David is above it all, and this can strengthen his monarchy here. So you can decide for yourself whether you think David is strengthened by this scene or not. So Nathan says, "Now Yahweh has put away your sin," literally passed over, using the Hebrew word. And my note below notes always implies movement from one place to another. But as Graham Auld notes, does not mean forgive, or at least does not mean forgive in the sense of wish away or remove the sin into nothingness. He notes that only here and one other time in the Masoretic text does the verb take sin or wrong as its object. So it could be forgiving here, but it could also mean just the sense of, I'm not going to focus on it. I, Yahweh, am not going to focus on it. You shall not die. And then we get the troubled part here. And Gilmore's note below is the suggestion that I was just making. But let's look at what she says so we can hear her words. So she says, "In the face of the failure of the northern ideology of popular support for monarchy in the Absalom rebellion, thus reshaping the story here as, quote, punishment as retribution linked with forgiveness." And so we'll see that play out in the Absalom rebellion in a few chapters. But then we hear this, and this can be shocking to many people. And I brought up Baden's quote separately so we can hear it live here. So I realize it's a little lengthy, but let's listen to this whole quote of Baden, which I think helps us to enter into this part of the story. "The story of the death of David and Bathsheba's firstborn son is, to put it gently, bizarre. First, it is odd that the child has no name. Second, Nathan's prophetic announcement implies that the punishment for David's sin will be inflicted on the child. Yet nowhere in the preceding oracle predicting Absalom's rebellion is it ever said that David would die. Third, and most important, the death of the firstborn child renders the lengthy preceding account of its conception moot. All of the demonstrations that David must be the father end up being a false lead, a blind motif. Once Solomon is the second son, the first child's paternity is a non-issue. All of this has led many scholars correctly to the conclusion that the account of the death of David and Bathsheba's firstborn is a later insertion. If it is excised, all of the arguments for David's paternity of the firstborn then make much more sense. Now they are arguments for Solomon being David's son. None of David's other sons are provided with detailed proof of paternity. Someone must have thought that Solomon was in fact not David's son. And when we get to the Solomon story in 1 Kings, which involves Nathan and Bathsheba in particular arguing to the perhaps senile David that he'd previously promised that Solomon would be a successor, even though we as readers have never heard such a promise, we can recognize there that in that situation, when Solomon begins to show what he's about in building the temple, as Halpern has noted, the temple is adorned with a lot of iconography that is Egyptian. And so Halpern goes so far as to suggest that perhaps Solomon was an Egyptian who was not either David nor Bathsheba's child, and was brought in to fill in the space when Judah was subject to Egyptian hegemony, but without being able to say that out loud, reinforced by the fact that the first woman whom Solomon takes to be one of his 1,000 women is Pharaoh's daughter. One of only 2 references to Pharaoh's daughter in the whole Bible, the other one being, of course, the one who saves baby Moses. So we'll see more of that unfold, but I just want to suggest the possibility here that the authors have put in this story of this first unnamed child distract us from the Solomon situation, which would be at issue. But of course, as so often with the story, we can't know that, but that's certainly a possibility. So let's continue with Nathan's comment, and then we'll look to our chiasm here. So he continues, nevertheless, because by this deed, it's not exactly clear which deed it is at that point, you have utterly scorned the Lord, literally doubling the despised we saw earlier. Despised or provoked, yes, despised or provoked. Alter suggests spurned. The New RSV omits the enemies of, that is part of the Hebrew there. Jansen suggests that it was inserted to avoid charging David directly with scorning Yahweh, and perhaps that's the case, and the New RSV translators have seen it that way. So, utterly scorned Yahweh, the child that is born to you shall die. And that's the scene we'll see. This is the second infinitive absolute in the verse, which to say when the words are doubled for emphasis, the way Hebrew would say something like very or absolutely. And so our scene ends with Nathan going to his house, and as I was noting earlier, at the beginning of the chapter when Nathan appeared out of nowhere, that we didn't know, does Nathan live in the palace with David, or where does he live? And now we find out he has his own house, although we don't know where it is in relation to either David's house or Uriah's and formerly Bathsheba's house. We just know that he lives separately. And so then it happens. Yahweh struck the child that Uriah's wife, Uriah's woman, bore to David, and it became very ill. And there are so many questions we can ask there, but one thing I want to at least pause for, and I noted this at the end of the last video, is the theological question that may well be bothering you. Why would God do something like that? And I want to note that what I'm suggesting here is nothing about the nature of the one true God, the Creator God. And in fact, I would affirm that God, in fact, doesn't do that kind of thing. What we're seeing here is a character in a story written by people to justify something about David's monarchy and the situation in Israel and Judah in their own time period, and not to make existential statements about the nature of Yahweh. Whether they believe that Yahweh did that kind of thing, we can't know what they believed, and it may well be possible, because the whole Deuteronomistic perspective has more of a sense of what we might call karma. You do this and I'll do that kind of response. But that's different than what we hear in much of the rest of the Hebrew Bible, and certainly different than what we hear in the religion of creation perspective that Jesus proclaims and embodies in the New Testament. So no claim here about this is something that God actually does. If you do something wrong, God may strike down your child. Let's not worry about that, I hope. So, and it became very ill. So back to the plot of the story here, this word for ill is only here in the Deuteronomistic history, 6 times in the Masoretic text, and one would wonder, why not just strike it dead? Why, what's going to turn out, as you can see in verse 18, to be a 7-day period in which David mourns here. Especially if we're suggesting this is a story inserted into here from some later time period. Why not just kill it? The reason must be to enable the scene that we see here to take place and what it says about David or doesn't say about David. So let's begin to turn to that. So, starting in verse 16, and Fackelman has the little chiasm below, which is this part, but I've expanded it to the larger chiasm. So David therefore pleaded, and pleaded is over-translating here from the word for sought here. Only here, though, does David seek God or Yahweh. All other uses of this verb, which is one of a couple of words in Hebrew for seeking, not the most common one, are people seeking David. This is the only time he's seeking. And one has to ask, is this sincere? We don't know. Notice he's appealing here to Elohim. It's been Yahweh throughout here, and it's Elohim here, and it'll be Yahweh, as you can see on the right side, further on. Might we hear in that, since Nathan is told that Yahweh is doing this, that David is appealing to a different God to protect him from Yahweh? Might it be that David believes that Elohim and Yahweh are different gods? Do the authors believe that? Almost certainly not, but it's hard to know for sure. So pleaded with Elohim for the child, or literally on behalf of, a word only used a couple other times, and then fasted. And it's a unique form of fasting here. It's Psalm here. The primary form omits the vowel, and it's found in all these other places. So just a difference in spelling. And so I see those all as the same word here. And I connected it with food so we could see the whole question of eating and not eating. That's a theme throughout here. And then he went and lay all night on the ground, matching Uriah back in chapter 11. And again, that's an element of the parallel I was noting in the beginning, even though this is not immediately, as you can see, part of the structural. Yeah, it is part of that structural scene from 6 to 15. Sorry, misstated my own comment there. So that is parallel. They both lay on the ground all night. And that suggests that maybe David is being Uriah to himself at some level, or pleading on behalf of Uriah, consciously or unconsciously. And his altar notes something similar. David's acts pointedly replicate those of the man he murdered. And then we hear a unique group here, the elders of his house. We only hear it here of such a group. We see other elders of Israel and of Judah, or of my people, of different places, and they're soon to be replaced by the slaves of David. It's curious that this group appears here. Who might they be? We'll find out as 2 Samuel continues, various other advisors and counselors of David, but never have we seen a group called this. But there they are. And they stood beside him, and the word for standing is twice here, the word for rise here. So literally, they stood beside him, making him rise. The urging him to rise is all one word, the same verb in Hebrew there. It's a little difficult to translate without adding an extra verb, to cause to stand. But they stood near him, standing him, if you will, from the ground. But he would not, was not willing, nor would he eat food with them. And Halpern suggests that Amnon's feigned fast in imitation of his father's mourning in chapter 13, when his own advisor tells him, pretend you're fasting and Tamar will nurse you. But even Halpern doesn't suggest that David's fasting here is feigned, but it might well be. So I'll scroll down so we can see the rest of our scene here, starting with verse 18. So, and my note here, as Borgen notes, breaking the pattern of death news, we expect messengers to bring David the news. They do not. We expect mourning. There is none. And then we hear what ought to be a pregnant phrase, certainly from Genesis 1 and 2, on the seventh day. The phrase is used seventh day 54 times in the Masoretic text, and 41 of those are in the Torah, distributed pretty evenly across the Torah, but only here in Samuel. Notice how it's a play on Bathsheba. The seventh Sheba is Sheba there, as well as oath, as we've seen it translated other times. So there's a certain play there. But it also is a symbolic period of time, whether we think of it as the week of creation and the Sabbath day, but certainly the general Sabbath sense of that. And so after that week, the child dies. And then we have this dramatic scene of how David is going to find out about it. And there's a lot going on here, but we're going to look at it relatively quickly to get through our passage today. And the slaves of David were afraid to tell him, and as my note below notes, not surprisingly, given that previous messengers bringing death notices to David, like at the end of 1 Samuel and the beginning of 2 Samuel, did not fare very well. And we'll see it again when Absalom dies, and messengers compete to bring David the message, and it makes clear that maybe you shouldn't be running so fast to tell David that Absalom, his son, is dead. So the servants of David were afraid to tell him the child was dead. And that's a spatial situation we don't know about. How do they know the child's dead? But David only finds out in the next verse by perceiving through their whispering. We don't know how this is arranged, but somehow they're more proximate to the child at this moment than David is. They're afraid to tell him, for they said, and notice the omniscient narrator who can hear their whispering before we're told they're whispering, while the child was still alive, we spoke to him, and he did not listen. Now, how then can we tell him the child is dead? He may do himself some harm. And as Jones notes out here, and I'll show it at harm, that's a bad translation here for a couple of reasons. First of all, it literally means make evil. But the question is he going to do it to himself or to somebody else? And as he notes down here, the insertion of the reflexive pronoun himself doesn't accord with Hebrew grammar, providing technical examples. And he says, quote, we may confidently state that the recipient of ra'ah, the word meaning evil, in 2 Samuel 12:18, is by no means the most salient feature of the clause. Ra'ah itself is the most prominent participant, syntactically and pragmatically, which is to say, it echoes both Yahweh's perception that what the thing David did was evil and Nathan's expression of it was evil in their eyes. And so now in the slaves' eyes, we don't hear the word, but they see him and think he might do some evil, perhaps to them or to anybody, but to do more evil, and echoing the sense that he's already done an evil that Yahweh and Nathan have called him on. So when David saw that his servants were whispering together, using a word only a couple of other times in the entire Hebrew Bible, he perceived that the child was dead, otherwise translated as discerning here. And David said to his slaves, is the child dead? And they said, in one word, dead. And so we'll scroll down a little more just to finish our long passage for today. And then suddenly we get what to the characters is surprising, but perhaps it ought not to be. As Falkman notes, David's behavior here is nearly the opposite of his response to the death of Uriah. So he rose from the ground, only one other place rising from the ground, that's in 1 Samuel 28:23, as you can see there, and washed, as Bathsheba did in 11:2 and in 11:8, and not elsewhere in 2 Samuel. And notice the only other uses of the verb are offering to wash feet or blood from a chariot. So this is the only human washing in either book of Samuel here, other than Bathsheba. Anointed himself, not using the Messiah word here, but what an ordinary person does, and we'll see it again in chapter 14, and changed his clothes. One of the many things connecting David with Joseph, who changes his clothes before he meets Pharaoh. And then he went mysteriously into the house of Yahweh, and we need to ask, what is this? We note back in chapter 7 that Yahweh through Nathan kept saying, who are you to build me a house, David? I'm the one to make you a house, and promising that David's offspring, that we know to be Solomon, who will build the house of Yahweh, which is to say the temple. But there is no temple now, and the phrase house of Yahweh will not be used again by Yahweh until it's about the temple in 1 Kings 7:12. So what is this place? We have no idea, but there it is. We had not known there was a place in Jerusalem that was the house of Yahweh. And it says he worshipped there, and as Jacob notes, David invokes God at each stage of the crisis, both before the child's death and afterwards, in complete contrast to his actions at the time of the sin. And again, I want to note how public this is. David is not alone in any of this, and so how much of this is performance and how much of this is sincere, it's impossible to say about David almost any time. So then he went down to his own house, and when he asked or sawed there, we last saw somebody sawing in 11:7, and we'll see it again in 14:18, they set food before him, and he ate. And again, noting that he's never alone. They're just following him around. And then down to see the end of our scene. So the servants then say out loud to him what they've been wondering about. What is this thing you have done? And that very pregnant phrase echoes Uriah's refusal at 11:11. I will not do such a thing. David's acts as summarized both by Yahweh and by Nathan as this thing he's done, and we have already seen it in verse 12 and 14 of our chapter. This thing you have done. So they could be asking about the Uriah Bathsheba thing he had done as much as this thing he had done, and we as readers can certainly hear all of that together. You fasted and wept for the child while it was alive, and then we can see weeping in Samuel. We've seen a number of times here, and we'll see it further for his other sons, Amnon and Absalom. But when the child dies, you rose and ate food, telling us, of course, what we know and what David already knows, just saying it out loud, with no question other than this to explain what their question is. And he answers this way. His answer is exactly following, by the way. The New RSV makes it sound like it's in reverse order, but it's the same order. I fasted and wept while the child was alive, for I said, who knows? Yahweh may be gracious to me, and the child may live. Now, to the extent that we're thinking this has an echo of Uriah, plainly he knows that Uriah is not alive. But perhaps while the message was gone out there and Uriah had gone out there and all the time it took to send Uriah and the messenger back, perhaps we can suggest that David is wondering and regretting, did I do the right thing? And perhaps Uriah will live, but that's, of course, speculation. And the reality is Uriah is dead, and now the child is dead. Alter suggests David speaks for the first time not out of political need, but in his existential nakedness. And Halberstam and Helms, who are so often reading with the keen eye of political scientist observers, say David's underlying capacity for heartfelt grief makes the grip that sovereign power exerts over its wielder all the more harrowing. But again, even for those two often suspicious readers, I want to ask, do we really know that this is sincere? Maybe he's actually glad this child is dead. It's hard to know. Can I bring him back again? And what's at issue is return, twice here, translated differently. Can I return him again? I will go to him, but he will not return to me. And of course, the child will not return, nor can Uriah return. And so we conclude with this. After that, we hear nothing from the servants, and we have these closing verses that take 9 months or so to happen. David consoled his wife, using the standard word for consoling that we've seen a number of times. There's literally his woman there. And now we hear her name is Bathsheba. She's no longer the wife of Uriah. She'll next be Bathsheba in 1 Kings, when she will plead on behalf of her son Solomon to David. And he went to her. And as my note below from Kalimi suggests, the earlier act was for him, but the latter act was for her, because it includes the pronoun her here, which it didn't in 11:4, and that may well be the case, and lay with her. And the 9 months go right by, and she bore a son, and she named him Solomon, as Halpern suggests, probably meaning his replacement, or God made good his loss. But he suggests Solomon is named to commemorate not the condemned son, but Uriah's son. And again, we'll look more at that when we look at the succession story in 1 Kings. But, and it says Yahweh loved him, and immediately the narrator signals that Yahweh is on Solomon's side. But he sent a message by the prophet Nathan, so he named him Jedidiah because of Yahweh. Which means beloved of Yahweh. Notice it has the same double D in it that David has in it, which also means beloved, but David doesn't have of Yahweh in it. Alter suggests, quote, perhaps a political calculation on the part of Nathan. He is already aligning himself with Solomon and with Bathsheba, figuring that in the long run it will be best to have a successor to David under some obligation to him. And as I note below, what right would a royal prophet have to name a child? And what's the mother's view? We never hear about Jedidiah again. And why is it because of Yahweh? And does anybody know about this except Nathan and the author? Does David know that Nathan gave it a separate name? We might note Jacob and the dying Rachel having a disagreement over to what name her second son, Ben-Oni or Benjamin, and he's only Benjamin after that. And again, one of the many connections between the Joseph story and the David story. So with that, we'll look next time at the closing scene that ends our section and return to the war as David and Bathsheba now have a new son, Solomon. See you next time for that. Bye-bye.